You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have a great guest today, author Ellis Amdur. He's a writer, an American practitioner of martial arts, and a crisis intervention trainer. He's published a number of books on martial arts and on crisis intervention, hostage negotiation, and also some fiction. I recently ran across some of his work on de-escalation of situations where you're involved with someone who's getting angrier and angrier, maybe they're in a state of rage. So I went through his book called Words of Power recently. It was really great. So I was looking forward to speaking to him. So here he is, and welcome, Ellis. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, if you would, tell us about your background. Were you like an angry young man and you learned about these techniques to be calmer, or what does it look like for you?
Well, yeah, I was a combination of an angry young man and tended to lose my fights. And I was brought up, unfortunately, it's become topical once again. I was brought up in a community that was redlined against Jews and blacks. And my family was a Jewish family that lived outside the red line, but the school system was good. And among the Jewish kids in my age group, I was somehow appointed to be the defender of the faith. And so when there was a problem, I was the one who was sort of nudged to deal with it, which I wasn't very good at, really. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. But I got fascinated with learning how to protect myself. And the verbal de-escalation piece was more or less instinctive. I would be in situations that were dangerous. In fact, I just remembered one. I was talking with a friend last night where I held a man's hand in his pocket as he was trying to pull a knife on somebody else. I was 19 years old. I knew nothing. But I was talking to him, and I realized that he didn't want to pull it, and so I had to talk to him in a way that would support his desire not to pull it, because if I said the wrong thing, he would feel like he had to. So it was something that, for whatever reason, tactical communication came to me naturally, and then that sort of stayed with me as I started training in martial arts, which I've done for about 50 years.
Yeah, I would think you'd see martial arts in a different way than many people would, especially people that haven't trained in it as long as you. So how does martial arts fit into de-escalation and, handling aggression, et cetera? I would guess most people think, you can defend yourself, you can fight back, you can do this or that, but what's your perspective on it?
Well, that's got to be part of the perspective because, for example, a pacifist who can't fight has to depend on the mercy of other people. A pacifist who chooses not to fight and chooses not to commit harm has a power and an authority, right? So we start with that I'd love to lead a peaceful life. I'd love to lead a life where I don't have to confront anybody, even verbally. It's not possible, but that's what I'd love. But as I started training martial arts, I went to Japan. I lived there 13 years, and I was studying and became eventually certified as a teacher in several archaic systems that were used to train people of the warrior class 400 years ago. And among what they had trained was the psychology of how you organize yourself in the face of someone who means you harm at arm's length or closer. So how do you organize yourself so you are calm enough to deal with that? But also, how do you organize yourself so that that person is put at a disadvantage so you can win the battle? When I came back to the States and started graduate school in phenomenological psychology, all that I had learned in Japan, I just flipped upside down. So instead of using that information to take advantage of somebody else, I was using the same information to support people when they were in crisis, to lead them to a safer place.
Well, how do you deal with someone that's an obvious aggressor and who wants to do you harm? Like, what does winning mean in that situation?
Well, it depends what level of aggression you're facing. Let's start with the extreme and work backwards. If someone tried to hurt myself or my family, my loved ones, I would physically make it impossible for him to do that. Simple as that. But most aggression is not on that level. Most aggression is some upset or angry person. And we can regard anger as an attempt at communication, but as we get aroused, we activate the parts of our brain that in vernacular we would call the mammalian brain. And the mammalian brain, because we're pack animals, is focused on dominance hierarchy. So if you and I start to get upset with each other, I start breathing quicker, my blood pressure goes up, I start panting, I start tensing my muscles. My mammalian brain is saying that person is trying to dominate me. But if I raise my voice, if I act in an intimidating way, I'll be able to get the message through to him. I don't particularly want to fight you, but I want to win the argument. Unfortunately, when we start focusing on dominance hierarchy, we do start thinking who's winning and who's losing, not the truth, which, as I'm sure you and everybody listening knows, is the state of our political discourse these days. So when people are at the level of anger, this is where we try to de-escalate the person. And de-escalation is going to be any tactic we use to assist them to become calm enough so that they can think clearly again. Now, if the person becomes aroused enough and they begin to get in a rage state, now an enraged person no longer wants to communicate. And again, to highlight that, angry people are trying to communicate. That's why they say, shut up, I'm not finished. You're not listening to me. It's very clear they're trying to communicate something, but they're not looking for discourse. They're looking for you to get the message, which is different from a dialogue.
I've seen people in fights, for many years, and there'll be a fight, and all of a sudden someone loses it, and they go crazy and try to attack the other person. I don't know if that's just rage or that's something else, but I've seen that in altercations sometimes.
Sure. So, well, think about this. I start to get angry with you. You're blowing me off. You're dismissing me. You're speaking to me contemptuously. I start to get more aroused. And then another part of my brain becomes increasingly activated. In the vernacular, this isn't neurologically 100% accurate, but for ease of communication, we would describe it as the reptilian brain, which is the survival brain. When I become aroused enough, I perceive the interchange between you and I as threatening my survival. And unfortunately, that brain cannot differentiate between a physical threat and an insult. All it determines reality by is how aroused this human system in my body is responding. So what can happen is when you and I are having an argument and I get to a certain level of arousal, my human brain is trying to say, there must be a way out of this. Why is he acting like this? My mammalian brain is, I don't like the way he's talking to me. I'm going to talk over to him. My reptilian brain is saying, no, I must eradicate this threat. And so there's, if you will, there's kind of an argument going on inside my head. And the rage state is the brain attempting, the primitive part of the brain, to disinhibit the rest of the brain so that it can act for a violent way. So you can have somebody who's right on the edge of violence, who's saying, get off of my property or I'll kill you. And they will. And so you step on their property, they feel the threat's reduced, and they don't fire that shotgun or whatever it might be. But if they get to a certain level, even if you do a conciliatory gesture, they can't perceive that, right? The threat is too extreme. That's when we enter the realm of violence. So the formula is, if you type this as 4 parts formula, when people are at baseline, if you think of 100 scale of arousal, 0 to about 25, that's baseline human brain dominant. We communicate through dialogue. And dialogue is response, doesn't mean equal numbers of words exchanged, but there's a freedom between us to communicate. In intensity, from about 20 to 95, not frequency, but intensity, we're in mammalian brain dominance, we're in anger. And now, if we're going to solve this problem, we have to de-escalate the angry person, right? Using any one of a number of strategies. Anybody who's been to couples counseling has heard about a sort of paraphrasing, and it's usually done in a rather silly way. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent. But basically, you're trying to...
I've heard of mirroring. How's that different from paraphrasing?
It's kind of the same. The problem with mirroring is if you repeat what somebody says word for word, they will pick up you're mocking me, just like when we were small children. I watched my grandsons do that to each other just the other day.
Oh, like copying each other?
Yeah. Another level of this, it goes by such names as motivational interviewing and things like that. What I hear you saying, what you're sharing with me, a very stereotypical way of talking, which is very hard to do if you were emotionally aroused yourself. So a paraphrase is just using common language, summing up your understanding of what the person's saying or doing. So, for example, when I was doing crisis outreach, I might knock on a door and some guy answers the door and he goes, "What the hell do you want?" And I say, "You really didn't want to see me today." I've paraphrased his attitude without mirroring the language. And then he might go on, it's like peeling an onion. And he says, "Yeah, I didn't want to see you. I was just drinking a beer and minding my own business, and here you show up. So you're having a good day." And then we peeled another layer and he goes, "Well, it wasn't that good. I mean, my wife let me say," and then we start to talk, peeling the layer one by one, right? So I'm informing him, this is how much your message has succeeded. Now, if it fails, because I'm not asking the question, they correct me.
In your example, the person responded to you, but what I felt when you first said that was a little actually confusion. I imagine myself in that situation, and if I said that to you and you said that, I feel like I would probably pause and be actually confused by what you said. Is that also a common response?
It happens, and confusion's great too, because when a person's confused and pause, they're actually thinking, right? And when people begin to think, they restore themselves to the higher brain function and they think through the problem. Like, I was just minding my own business. My wife left me yesterday. Do I really need to punch the social worker? Is that going to make my life better? Right? And so if he's confused and thinking about it, the thought that maybe it's not a good idea to get arrested again may come to mind. So it's not that I'm deliberately trying to confuse the person with a web of words, but if they're thinking about what I said and what it means to them, that's always a positive step.
Okay.
Now, the dilemma is if they become so agitated that they become enraged, they no longer care what I have to say. And so I can't de-escalate them. And this is a flaw actually in a lot of law enforcement training, that you'll have somebody screaming, "I'm going to cut your throat." And the officer, for example, draws his taser and says, "Step back." And then somebody might say, "Why didn't you de-escalate him?" Because when a person's in a rage state, we don't use de-escalation tactics, we use control tactics. And the control tactic is based on what kind of rage they're presenting. And without getting very dramatic, for example, I called up a friend and we got into a political discussion. And all of a sudden he started yelling at me. And I said, "Look, I already know what you think about this issue. Yelling at me isn't going to change things." So he yelled at me some more. And I said, "If you yell at me again, I understand that to mean you and I have nothing else to talk about. I'll hang up the phone." And so that's a control tactic. I'm not validating his feelings in the least. I'm just saying, I don't like the way you're treating me, and you'll stop.
How do you differentiate that between someone saying like, "This conversation's over," because they get uncomfortable? It seems like some people nowadays are on a hair trigger about that, and you can't really get anywhere with them because they just run and hide at the first sign of resistance.
Right. And, because of some of the ways our society is developed, that feelings are very much overvalued from the time our children are very small, that seems to be a much more common response. And I think every one of us who doesn't choose to live that way has to realize you just can't talk to some people anymore. And unless there's an abiding interest that I must talk to a person, if a person gives me that smarmy, "This conversation's over, blah, blah, blah," I say, all right. And that's one less person I have to disturb myself with.
Oh, I thought you were going to have like a tool for every scenario, no matter what someone does. But
well, it is. Disengagement is a very valuable strategy, right? Let's say you're an attorney and you have a client who is just acting like a jerk. And you get overvested. "Oh, I'm an attorney. I'm his attorney. I've got to help him through this case." And he's treating you with contempt, distaste, all the rest. And at a certain point, you may say, "Well, look, you're entitled to have that attitude with me, but I'm entitled to no longer be your attorney. You can find somebody else," right? And then the person can say, "Well, you don't deserve any attitude that I'm giving you." I say, "Get out of my office. No, I'm going to jail," right? Or they say, "Well, blah, blah, blah." And then we begin to talk about it. So again, what do I have to lose? Now, if I'm the client, we're about to go into court, and my attorney has an attitude, and he's not being, she's not being a very nice person to me, I may have to tactically communicate with my attorney because it's kind of too late to try to find a new attorney because we're stepping into the courtroom in 5 minutes, and my house is in foreclosure, right?
Right.
So then I can't say, "Well, if you're going to take that attitude, I'm just going home," because I can't. So maybe, for purely tactical reasons, I'm going to have to say something like, I was wrong. You are really the smartest person I've ever met. And blatantly manipulate that person if that's the best tactic to get them to work for me.
Okay. I've noticed, I don't know, maybe it's unique to me, but I've noticed if I can keep my calm in a conversation, sometimes if someone's getting really upset, I actually see a dial on the wall and I think, should I turn it up or turn it down? And a lot of times I'll be like, all right, I'll turn it down. But sometimes I'm like, to hell with it. And I turn it up, and go after them. Any strategies or tactics that people can somehow keep presence of mind if they're dealing with someone that's like really aggressive or angry so that they don't lose it and they can keep the situation from escalating?
Yeah. There's a subset of people who don't feel like being angry is a negative. Many people, probably most of the people listening today, when they get angry, say at their child or their spouse, if they don't in the moment, later they feel bad. There's a subset of people, and I'm not talking about immoral people, who are just wired that. They're wired for the fight. Oh, you want some of this? I'll give you some of this. And so it's very hard for them to calm themselves down because they feel good when they're relinquishing control. And what I mean control is they're relinquishing control not only of themselves, but of the discourse, of the situation. So the first step is to recognize if you are that type of person, because that can really end up negative, even though you feel good.
Literally feel good sometimes, just like, I guess, just letting it all out, yelling and screaming.
Yeah. Some people like that, or being sarcastic or putting somebody in their place, things like that. The second step is physiological. It is very important to recognize by physical sensation what emotion you are in. You see, emotions are not exactly physical. They're a sort of this liminal state that is between a physical reaction and an intellectual reaction and something else. But sensation is purely physical. So when I'm angry, I should know how I organize. That for myself, my shoulders tighten up a little bit. I get a little smile on my face and my eyes open wide, which you might say, well, thinking about that, that's indicative of your character. But I don't want to be preoccupied with psychologizing. I just want to be able to recognize this. And then what I know is situations work out best for all concerned when I slow my breathing down. And so even though I feel good, I need to resist that temptation and use one or another kind of tactical breathing. In Words of Power, I have what I think is the most effective way because it really tunes us into our own body. There's a very commonly used and effective way of breathing you could call cadence breathing. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, and exhale for 4. The only thing I don't like about that is it requires you to count in your head when your mind should be on the situation. Nonetheless, there are different types of breathing that you should recognize. The best way to think of it is not like, oh, I'm a sage right now, I'm enlightened, but like a cat walking on the edge of a fence. The cat is ready to jump off at any moment, ready to keep her balance, ready to leap up to a tree limb, ready to get into a fight on the top of the fence if another cat comes its way, right? So this kind of dynamic, calm balance. Or another image I like to use, if you think about a skater, a kid on a skateboard going down a steep hill, and they're just gliding along. Their body is so relaxed in this kind of slack S curve as they go around the corner. And there's a car right in front of them. And they stomp on the back rail, stop dead. The board flips up in the air. They flip off the driver, throw the board down, and skate around them. Their heart rate hasn't changed because they are skilled at managing that situation from beginning to end. And so the cultivation of a breathing method in which you can physically recognize, I'm ready for anything, the best of me is now involved.
This may sound silly, but if someone listening wants to go practice this, I mean, they shouldn't create deliberate situations where there's someone angry at them, but how can they find practice in a safe way?
Actually, it's a great question. So the first thing to do is, for example, that you would use circular breathing, the method I have in Words of Power. You'll recognize that you are beginning to get skilled at this when you will feel a physical sensation. Whatever, you can call it whatever you want, anything from auto-hypnosis to circulating your chi or your prana, doesn't matter. But when you feel that circulation through your body, which I know the air doesn't circulate that way, but there you go. What I'm going to do is choose the minor stresses of life. I'm stuck in traffic. I am going to be late. There's nothing I can do about it. I will do my breathing. Now, a corollary of that is, that may make the wait in traffic a little better, but that's not the point of this. Add one more example. I'm in the supermarket. I've just put 7 items on the 10-item fast checkout line, and the person in front of me has laid down 15 items. 2 people are trapped behind me, and they turn around and start talking to me about their food allergy. And, my own food allergies are endlessly interesting to me. Other people's, I could care less, right? Do your breathing. Now, what the goal of this is when we get stressed out, we have typical physiological responses. Some of us hold our breath. Some of us begin to breathe faster. We compress our lips. We raise up. We tense up. We do these different things. And we're creating a feedback mechanism between our body and our mind. Yeah, you're really pissed off. This person's in your face. Yeah, and it amps itself up. But what I'm going to try to teach myself to do using the minor stresses of life is anytime I'm presented with a stressor, I breathe slower. If I do this enough, I will create, I'm not the first person to use this term, but a pseudo instinct, a trained behavior that I cannot not do because I've trained it so much. In sports psychology, there's a phrase, an amateur is somebody who does something very well. A professional is somebody who can't not do it that way.
So if you want to have a certain response to stressful situations, you got to put in the work. You got to train yourself to have that response many times.
But life will give you, so many examples on a daily basis of minor stressors so that when something major comes along, it becomes almost automatic that our breathing is slower.
I know a good way to train is call government offices and ask for services. Train people to be very patient.
Yep. Or tech support. One of the best crisis intervention people I ever dealt with is I had some report to a court that was due the next day, and my router went out, and I called tech support, and I got a kid with a very thick accent. I couldn't understand him very well. And I said, I have to ask, where do you live? And he said, oh, sir, I am from Egypt. And I want to assure you that no matter what happens, I will be with you until this problem is solved. As long as it takes, I will be with you. And I felt like he reached out and was holding my hand. And, it literally took about 2.5 hours. And he stayed with me, made conversation about his village, and he was a master of what he did.
That's cool. When I've heard disingenuous script reading, it makes me angry, though. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. They're not. They're just reading a script. Like, what do you do if you're dealing with someone that doesn't really seem to care? And again, they're just reading a script and they don't seem to be able to come off script. Like, how do you get through to someone in a frustrating situation like that?
Again, you start with how important is it? But let's say it's important. I'll give you an example which wasn't a script, but it functions the same way. One of my little grandsons was just here. He got a blackberry thorn in his foot. It wasn't very deep, but he's a kid who just is wired to really feel pain very intensely. And I told him, I'm going to put ice on it first, and it's going to hurt for a fraction of a second, then it won't hurt at all as soon as I pull this out. And I did what I said, but as I was about to pull the thorn out, he started shrieking and crying. And I said, I'm not going to use his name. He deserves that respect. But I said, you're hurting my feelings right now because you're saying you don't trust me. I told you it would hurt for a fraction of a second, that you could not even blink. And you're acting like I'm going to hurt you really bad. And he sort of, and while he was saying, I pulled the thorn out. So there's no formula for this, but when somebody else is formulaic, we do something to derail them of their formula, which requires them on one level or another to mentally blink. It may be, we're going to talk all day and get nowhere if we continue this dialogue as it is. We have to do this differently.
I like that phrase, you're getting someone to mentally blink. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be brutal. Sometimes, recounting stories, I can, and other people in this field can recount their most dramatic stories because they're really cool. But a lot of this is just, as you say, getting somebody to blink. It's a momentary thing that reboots the discourse.
Yeah, I always wonder, what if someone's being aggressive and mean with you and you pretend to cry, like, why are you so mean to me? Pretend to wail and get really upset. Would that derail them, or would that just make them angrier?
So, a sadist would be delighted, right? A person who genuinely cares about you and has, in a sense, lost his or her bearings, maybe the first time they go, oh, I didn't mean to. But if you try that the second time, you're going to be playing the victim, won't you?
Yeah.
You want that strategy.
So, there's the, I guess, if in a confrontational situation, there's fight, flight, and freeze. Do most people freeze? It seems like they do in the face, especially in the face of anger or violence. How can you train yourself the right way, depending on the situation you're in?
So there's actually 5. There's fight, flight, freeze, flinch, and faint. So faint, of course, is the most extreme. In certain cultures, for example, Victorian 19th century Europe, upper class women only had that option. So they checked out of situations.
Oh, they would literally faint and fall to the ground.
Yeah, because they didn't have any other option that they were allowed to have. They would have been ostracized anything else they did.
Yeah, I've heard there's certain goats, you scare them and then fainting goats, I guess they fall down and faint, right?
Yeah, I truly don't know on an evolutionary basis what the advantage of that is, but it does exist, yeah. I think flinch is universal when something is flying at us very fast. Some people particularly people with a history of abuse, verbal abuse or otherwise, tend to flinch when somebody raises their voice. Freeze is interesting because, in fact, every animal, even momentarily, will freeze and evaluate before they move in most situations. For example, if you have a cat walking across your lawn and you clap your hands and startle the cat, the first thing it does is it freezes and looks at you. Then it decides to run away. You'd have to do something that undeniably made the cat think I'm about to be killed for it to not freeze for that fraction of a second. Many of us humans will get stuck in the freeze, which is the evaluation phase, and neither flight, run away, or fight. So again, some of this has to do with training. And that's one of the purposes of martial arts, that you get in situations where you realize somebody pinning me down on the ground with their body weight, unlike the way this used to feel, does not have 100% advantage over me because I know how to move in such a way that they will fall off to one side, for just one example. Another example, somebody's choking me, but I know what to do because they don't have that choke on all that well. They don't know what they're doing. I'm going to be able to get out of that, and so I will. And so what happens is in more and more situations, if we train for them, they aren't strange and threatening. We've already been there. We've experienced it. And we know that won't kill me. The scariest thing is a thing that we have no familiarity with.
No.
And, when I started in mental health, my supervisor told me to go down to the drop-in center and have lunch with the chronically mentally ill people who hung out there all day.
Why?
And I was like, high voice, what? And she said, yeah, they cook the meals. And I'm like, what? And she cried at me and just said, get going. So I went down there, because I sort of got in the mental health field without really having any experience, any paraprofessional, any volunteer, nothing. I came back from Japan, went to graduate school, and then started working. And so a bunch of people, some of them not smelling very good, swarmed around me. And simultaneously, somebody said, what's your name? And somebody said, how tall are you? And for some reason, I decided to respond to the second question first. And I said, 6'6". And she said, oh, no, 666. The devil is here. And this the devil is here. And people were edging away. And, I don't know if you can see me on the screen, but I could understand why somebody would think so looking at me.
I'm sorry, that's funny.
It is funny. And, that was the start. Now, first of all, they had some good cooks. And what happened was the people I was seeing in the afternoon who were not in crisis, who were just hanging out, at midnight might be the person whose home or whose shelter I was called to, who was then suicidal. And because two things, I was now familiar with a lot of strange behaviors that I realized, wow, those people, that person's acting really weird, but that's not dangerous. It's just weird. And on the other hand, the patients had seen me, had eaten with me, had broken bread with me. I was not some stranger. They already had an experience of, if you will, being nourished to be in my presence. And that was
okay.
So looping back to your question, that which we are not familiar with is going to be that which we are not able to manage very well. And martial arts, in my mind, its main purpose is it's a laboratory for real life. It prepares, it's unless you're going to fight in a ring, that's not your job. It ain't real life, right? Or if you're going to military learning modern combatants. So it's a laboratory and as if practice to prepare for analogous situations that happen in the real world.
Yeah, like I've done Tai Chi for about 8 years and we did push hands, and that was really interesting because you learn what it feels like to feel someone's weight and to push and then be pushed, and it really helps quite a bit.
I absolutely agree. I love Tai Chi. And it's for some people, it's so slow and the push hands. I mean, that's not a real fight. Yeah, it's not a real fight, but you're learning so much about balance, not only other people's balance, but you're learning your own balance. And then you're learning about your internal emotional balance. How do you handle losing? How do you handle winning?
Yeah, how do you handle someone that's being a jerk and not really playing by the rules? That kind
right.
of thing. Yeah.
And can you say that is a good practice partner for me to have? Or do you just say, I want to quit. I hate this person.
All right, so martial arts has done that for you. But again, what are outlets for people to be able to practice safely? What could they seek out? Like, what are some examples?
I think one of the best examples or one of the best things to do is what law enforcement officers in a well-run agency do after something happens, an after-action review. And an after-action review is dispassionate look at what happened, what went wrong, what went right. So let's say my wife and I are bickering and it ends at that moment unpleasantly. Well, what I could do is go off by myself and brood about it and plan my revenge and, plan what I'm going to say next time. Or I'm going to say, I've been with this woman for 24 years and she is so wonderful and I'm so pissed at her right now. What's going on? What happened in our communication that I was not able to, say what I wanted to say to get my point across or whatever that is. And then I'm going to look at how was I organized? Did I enter the discussion already physically tense, which meant physically I was ready for a fight with her? Or was I, in fact, in that open, spacious skateboarder kind of stance? And why did I lose it? So I'm going to review those things, and I want to have a touchstone of sort of physical ease. The situations work best if throughout, just like you would know from Tai Chi, when you are in that state of dynamic relaxation, it's not flaccid relaxation, it's a tensile relaxation. And that's true emotionally. How adaptable am I? How able am I to realize I had the wrong impression of the situation, I need to reboot, as opposed to committing regardless, because if I backtrack now, I'd lose the argument. So reviewing situations in a dispassionate way is a way to prepare for the next time it happens. And the guarantee is whatever situation you have trouble with another human being is going to happen again and again and again. And we're either going to repeat the same pattern of mistakes or do better the next time.
So, I mean, who in that we'll see out in the world is trained to de-escalate? Like, are bouncers trained that way, or police trained that way, or security guards trained that way, or this training really is absent from a lot of professions that really need it?
The answer to that is yes and no to all of it. I've probably worked with 500 different police agencies teaching these skills. I have a basic principle is I respect the house I'm in. And so I would never come into a police agency as a mental health professional and try to teach mental health skills or teach how I would handle a client. I first learn enough about their profession to know how law enforcement officers are expected to act, what they're required to do, and try to tailor-make these skills to that profession. So, and I'm certainly not the only trainer out there. In fact, I'm retired, so I'm definitely not one of the trainers. But there are a lot of agencies that there are some very, very skilled officers. And one of the most interesting bits of research I've ever read is that SWAT-trained cops have the lowest use of force complaints of any police specialty. The meme that's gotten in too much society is militarized police, blah, blah, blah. The SWAT police, they have too many weapons, blah, blah, blah. SWAT trained cops have the least complaints because they train regularly on physical issues. They have an inner knowledge that if this situation goes sideways, I can handle that too. And so that confidence is reflected in how they interact with people. And by and large, they're not arrogant, overbearing individuals. Right? They're confident people. Just like if you ever watch a good pro boxer walk to the ring, he or she is a graceful, calm person, not all agitated.
So most people, unless you're dealing with a real crazy person, most people are going to be safer dealing with a trained person than with just some random person off the street.
Yeah. Now, the issue you mentioned, bouncers, In England, they actually have a certifying process that the police, they were having so many fights with doormen and bouncers that they decided to co-opt them. And so to become a doorman in Britain, you have to go through a certifying course. And, you get a badge or a certificate you have to renew every year. So you're part of the team. And in the process, you develop some and learn some basic skills. So trained individuals, in America, it's the Wild West. There are some bouncers who are masters at this. Their attitude is, the bar gets damaged, I've failed. So I'm going to keep the peace regardless, right? There are other individuals in other bars that they don't care, where, just have people who are thugs and looking for a fight. Security professionals, the same thing. There are 3 times as many security guards as there are law enforcement officers, and they are woefully undertrained. Some companies do a good job of making sure their employees get some real good training. Others do not. Correctional officers are among the best verbally skilled people I've ever met, on average.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah. There are toxic prisons, no doubt. But if you consider this, that a correctional officer is managing a pod or a wing with 25 or 50 people, he or she is not armed, right? And they're with people who are very dangerous. There is a kind of agreement that you guys want to get out, so I'll treat you with respect. You treat me with respect. If somebody doesn't, then, you call the troops, so to speak. But when I've done training for correctional institutions, I have never had an audience that I would say 98% of the correctional officers are listening to every word, taking notes. How can I use this? How can I keep myself and not only my team, but how can I keep the inmates safe? Again, contrary to stereotypes we sometimes hear.
How often do you see that the most problematic people are the ones that will provocate to get someone angry, to get into a fight? Is that correlation true? Or, again, who are the most difficult type of people to deal with, and what will they do?
Well, there's different types of really difficult people. Now, you're talking about the person who is responsible for de-escalating, or the people who are just generally a danger to us?
Yeah, it's people that are genuinely a danger to us. How can we tell? What kind of warning signs will we see?
Okay. Probably the most typical individual, if you just think of a typical road rage incident where the person amps themselves up, is pacing, think of that as a war dance, is yelling, glowering, maybe pounding their chest, hitting objects, basically an adult throwing a tantrum. They are amping themselves up to violence. Think of that as hot rage. That, for an ordinary individual, is the most common type of rage that you would run into. Less common are, for example, chaotic rage, what you would expect from somebody on an overdose of bath salts or ketamine or something like that. The person who's like, I don't mean to degrade anybody by the image, but acting like Taz in the Bugs Bunny cartoon. They're very, very difficult for anybody to deal with because there's not much of a thinking person accessible because of their, delirium state. You have terrified rage. This is a person who's like a cornered wolf. For most of us, how often are you going to run into that? But this individual is, for most of us, pretty easy to deal with because they say, get away from me. I'll hit you if you come near me. So what do? We pull back. For most of us, unless we're in a very specific profession, there is no need to come up on somebody who is frightened. Okay? And then the final type of rage you have is cool or predatory rage. And that's the person who can maintain full cognitive functioning while intending to do us harm. That's the movie villain, right? That's the one that we're so afraid of, and it's so rare that we would run into.
Oh, that's good. So you're saying it's very rare you'll run into someone that's cold, calculating, and also provocating. Usually it's more crass or obvious or coming from a place of fear or just loss of control.
Yeah. So the most common is hot rage. And if you think about it, just to do like a quick kind of sort of formula. So my next door neighbor who's lost it is yelling and start throwing things over the fence, stomps around, and he punches a hole in my fence. He's cursing me out. He's spitting, pounds my car, and starts walking toward me. So let's arrange all that on a ladder. Each rung of the ladder is a more immediately dangerous behavior. Now, he just called me an anti-Semitic slur, and I hate that sort of thing. That's irrelevant right now because he's stomping toward me. He pounded my car. He's stomping toward me. The most dangerous thing, the top rung of the ladder, is he's coming toward me. And I'm going... Now, of course, if I can escape and get behind a barricaded door, of course, that's choice number one. But if I couldn't escape, then I'm going to say step back, step back. I don't say stop, because a person could stop while they're too close to me. They've complied and they're too close. I want them moving in the opposite direction. Now, if they don't step back, which again is the rarest of the rare, we now are being assaulted. And now we take whatever defensive actions we can. That's self-defense. But what most people are going to do is howling all the way, they're going to step back. Or a subset is the person who smirks on the way back and said, oh, you're glad I'm stepping back. I'll do a tap dance on your face, man. But they're stepping back. That's the bluffer who might hurt us, but they're doing that to save face. Okay, so they step back. So the next thing they do is they start punching my car again. Or let's make it a step further. They start punching their own car. Why would you care? Because it's stimulating behavior, and the car doesn't scream with pain like they would like you to do. And so you say, stop hitting things. I keep it general because, if they stop hitting the car, they hit the fence post. So stop hitting things. And they say, it's my own goddamn car. I'll hit it if I want. And I don't get into a dialogue. I don't say, well, it's your insurance. I ignore that. I stay on the ladder. And I just say, stop hitting things. They step forward, I say, step back. Now, what's important is I don't yell. I drop my voice in my chest so it vibrates from the chest. In the mammal kingdom, vibrato from the chest is taking the alpha position, taking the dominant position. And it's not only...
But what if the person says, you can't tell me what to do, and it ramps them up even more?
You say, step back. In other words, what they're saying is irrelevant. If they're too close, it's an assault. And then we have to defend ourselves. That's all we have left, right? And this is where people get into quite reasonably such things as learning proper concealed carry techniques, which is reasonable for some people, going to martial arts classes. But again, here I am, I'm 72 years old. I've probably been in 2 or 3 situations at this edge in my life, and I was in an environment where you would expect it. Thankfully, for most of us, in most situations, these are the rarest of the rare. And far more people are going to be enraged than truly violent. The fact is, though, that if I'm going to say step back and I'm organized, standing properly to defend myself, if things do continue to escalate, I'm still as ready as I possibly could be for that. But if I say, please, I didn't mean to offend you, what can I do to make this right? If this guy's in a state of rage, as you and I were talking about at the very beginning, that's going to be intoxicating. He now has a victim, right? Which is something we are seeing geopolitically when, for example, Israel is encouraged to negotiate with people who say we want to kill you. Right. And negotiation is taken by people who only intend to annihilate you. Negotiation is taken as weakness, not strength. Okay.
Yeah, which again, as I said before, seems to activate their prey drive even more.
Yes, exactly. So let's say, continuing our ladder situation here, so they stop pounding the car and they're just pacing and yelling and swearing. And again, I'm in a situation I can't escape from. Maybe I'm an attorney, it's somebody in my office. And I would say at that point, sit down. And you say, wait a second, I don't want to sit down, I want to leave the office. But think about the vast journey from your office past 2 cubicles, past your receptionist, when they're in an escalated state. Who might get hurt in that process? I want them calmer. And if I say, so I would say, sit down. We'll talk about it when you sit down. Or, yeah, I know you're upset. We'll talk about it when you sit down. Sit down. I don't say please, because that's an irrelevant syllable to an enraged person. Okay? So again, if they step toward me, I say step back. In other words, what they get from me is there's no other message, no matter what your behavior, but this. So let's say they sit down and they're cursing me and yelling at me. Well, the yelling is more stimulating no matter what they're saying. So I say, I can't hear you when you're yelling. Lower your voice. I can't. And they say, it doesn't make sense. I say, my ears just don't work that way. Lower your voice and we'll talk about it.
Huh, that's interesting. Okay.
And then, so let's say they do lower their voice and they're cursing me out and saying all kinds of things. I say, talk to me with the same respect I talk to you. We'll talk about it and you stop swearing. So then the question comes up. Let's say an attorney is listening to this, since we started with that sort of hypothetical. And you say, what are we going to talk about? Depends on the situation. But the last thing I want to do is reward that person. So in other words, they semi-tipped over my desk, dropped things on the floor, threatened to hurt me. And now we're going to talk about it. Are we going to immediately go into, okay, let's talk about your continuance? Are we going to say something like this? Mr. Amdur, I'm well aware that you are very worried about this case. Sir, we are talking about it. I'm aware that you're worried about this case, but as worried as you may be, that does not give you the right to come into my office, knock things on the floor, threaten me or anybody else in this office. You will go home now, sir. We are talking about it. If you would like to finish our discussion, be at your phone at 4:45. I will call you then. We will discuss on the phone how we will handle this case from this point forward. And I expect you will treat me with the same respect I treat you. Now leave my office. So,
what if the person feels ashamed and it inflames their anger? Maybe some people would take that as you're shaming them.
So there are two things that are going on. The one thing is, as I am speaking, I am assessing. And I also, particularly if you have a client, you know something about them. So if you have somebody who, for example, is honor-based, I do not want to shame them because their face, their name is all they have. So I might deliver the message differently. If, for example, the person is advocating for their child, I might say, I understand you are very worried for your child. And a parent worried for their child will do anything for their child, but that cannot include threatening me or my staff. Mr. Amdur, you have to go home now. We'll talk about this. I'm going to call you at 4:45. I understand you're worried about your daughter. We will talk about this, right?
Yeah, that's a good way. Yeah.
So there has to be an assessment. Who am I speaking with? It's not like a cookie cutter that everybody gets the same message in the same tone of voice. But the overriding rule has got to be you should never reward somebody for putting you in fear. Because if you do, that is the new starting point from your next conversation. Any territory we give away to an aggressor becomes their territory from that point forward.
So there's the physicality, and then there's the words you say. For the average person, going about their day, what kind of phrases, like what kind of situations can they expect that are most probable, and what kind of phraseology can they develop with practice to help, de-escalate those situations? Like, is there a small subset for most people?
Well, look, for most people, and if you think about the book you mentioned, Words of Power, that's part of a series of 13 books. The first 12, each was written for a specialty profession that dealt with aggressive people on a regular basis. So one book was for police, a separate book for probation officers, for example, a book for families who live with individuals who suffer from mental illness. In other words, aggression is going to be almost a daily activity. And then a lot of people said, well, how about a book for ordinary people? And so I distilled down this book, Words of Power, and I had 3 critical readers. One of whom was my wife, a former ballet dancer. One was a writing professor in British Columbia, and the third was a physical therapist in Pakistan, all women. And basically what they did is they went through the book and they would highlight sections and say, that's really interesting, but I've never run into it in my life. And so what's in Words of Power is what ordinary people run into. And the main thing is most of what we run into is anger. And if there is one tactic to master with angry people with whom we must communicate, right? It could be trying to return something to a store. You were charged the wrong amount of money on your coffee order, and the barista's getting feisty. Things like that. The very first thing to master is what I mentioned before, breathing. Because even if you deliver the wrong message, if you're breathing and you are calm, the other person perceives you as not threatened and non-threatening. And that tends to calm most people down. Now, if there's one specific verbal strategy, it's something we talked about, and I certainly can't teach it just in these few moments here, but it is paraphrasing. When ordinary conciliatory gestures don't work, for example, with a barista, they didn't charge me and they don't want to look at the check again. I'm going to paraphrase their attitude. I'm going to say, looks like you're really having a rough day. What I don't do is ask a question, right? Are you having a rough day? Because remember, if an angry person is trying to communicate, a question shows your ignorance. The communication has failed because you have to ask what's obvious. But if you say, you look like you're having a really rough day, and I go, yeah, I'm having a rough day, and then you get in my face about the charge and stuff, and I might say, so I'm not the first person. I say, no, it's been like this since 8 a.m. Ooh, that's a long day. Yep. And so basically I'm trying to peel the layers until I can get to a point where I say, look, would you just do me one favor? Would you look at this check and add it up with me? Because I think there's an error. I'm not blaming anybody. I just can't afford to be spending more money than is in my pocket. Right? Now, if I said that from the very beginning, I'd probably get blown off. But if I have demonstrated I get the kind of frustrating situation they're in, there's more likelihood that there's going to be conciliation.
Yeah, because they're being listened to. That makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there ever a point in deliberately taking someone a bit further up the scale so the letdown is more powerful? Maybe that's not a nice thing to say. Maybe there's some personal satisfaction in there, but is there ever a time where that should be the strategy? Make him a bit more upset, but then come down.
I can't really think of one like that. I mean, I can think of times, for example, with my sons, when I deliberately, tactically escalated myself because they were not getting that this was serious, and they were now at a level of manhood. They were not little boys. And they, for example, talking to their mother in a way that was outrageous. I mean, one of the most wonderful moments of my life was when I was 15 or 16. I was an angry kid, and I was giving my mother grief. And my father, who was very ill, struggling with cancer, comes back to my room, and he looks me in the eyes and he says, "Ellis, the first thing I want you to know is I love you more than I can possibly express. But I also want you to know that I treasure your mother more than anything on this earth, and I understand you're giving her grief. If you ever do that again, I will gladly throw you out of this house and never see you again." And he smiled at me and walked out of the room. And I had this combination of outrage and fear, and beyond it, I had this like thrill. Wow. So that's a man. That's how a man protects his woman. That's and anything less than that, if he tried to understand the tough time I was having in high school, if we went through one of those standard kind of psychological like dissections of what it's like to be a teenager, would have had no effect whatsoever. But in that sense, he escalated in the service of peace, but he didn't do it to provoke me. He just basically said, this is far more serious than you comprehend, and you better take it seriously.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Well, excellent. Ellis, thanks for the time. It's been a really great call. For listeners, is the recommendation, if they want to learn these de-escalation techniques, go to Words of Power, unless they're a particular kind of professional? Like, what would be your recommendation for people to take a first step towards helping themselves?
Yeah. In terms of the skills that I have offered, Words of Power, and then there's a second book called The Accord Agent, Managing Highly Problematic Situations in the Business Environment. That's the art of communication in more subtle situations where aggression is a part. If you're curious about any of my writing, if you go to edgeworkbooks.com, it's got links to Amazon, which is where you find everything, and other places as well. But Words of Power is the sort of the first book to start with. Okay.
Well, excellent. Well, Ellis, thanks so much for all that you do. I mean, there's so many, as I said offline, being from New York, I'm used to confrontation, unfortunately. And, it's no good to fight all the time. It just wears on you, and it can be dangerous, and it is far better to de-escalate. So I really appreciate you being here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.